Hello everybody and welcome back to another Wainrider Wednesday, the weekly series where we look at progress for the upcoming mod for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion, Total War Wainriders. This is a mod set in the Third Age of Middle-earth, well before the events of the Lord of the Rings, but featuring some factions you will of course know and some you may not have heard of. This is the last episode in what has been looking at the campaign side of things for all of the playable factions in the mod. We have another series of videos that preceded this one, which looked at the unit rosters for all of these factions. And this is the one where we've just gone all over the map and taken a look at the starting positions and talked a bit about the strategy, the potential options, and threats for all of the various factions in Total War Wainriders. And this last one is returning to the Wainriders themselves with the faction of Great Rune. And the thing that I want to start off this video by talking about is that split between the two primary Wainrider factions that we feature in the mod. You may think that if you've heard of the Wainriders at all, you may think of them as a single faction. They are certainly presented not in a lot of detail in the lore. However, if you read through Rhun and Eorl, there is a more detailed account of the Wainriders than that which appears in Appendix A. Appendix A has about a page where it talks about the Wainrider Wars. But Rhun and Eorl, which is a sort of a short text in Unfinished Tales, goes into considerably more detail. And from that, there are a couple of terms that caught my eye. Now, in the first design of the mod, I did indeed have the Wainriders as a single faction, and they owned territory all the way from the border of the map pretty much to the Anduin. And that, as you can imagine, presented a bit of a challenge because, how could you balance that against a faction like Gondor, which, would have a lot of territory, but what about the other neighboring factions in the area that would have to be around? And so it's set up for this potentially very large, but also very snowbally start. Or at least it could have done. I never got terribly far in the development of that vision because we got other people involved with the team, thankfully, to help sort all this out. But one of the things that I sort of settled on fairly early was that there was this distinction, actually, in the lore, in that, particularly in the text of Rhun and Eorl, which referred to the Wainriders as really a couple of different groups. There were a couple of distinct groups. So the first group was what we saw in the very first preview campaign video, which is the Western Horde. This is the faction that emerged in 1860, 1861, I believe, and began their invasion of the area of Rovanion. This is a territory that had been held by Northmen in sort of a loose allegiance to Gondor, let's say, for quite some time. Now, these people, of course, are not in the lore referred to as the Western Horde, but there is a term for them, and that is the Wainriders of Rovanion. In contrast to that, in the later years of the Wainrider Wars, we hear about not Great Rune, but we hear about the Eastern Wainriders. So there are the Wainriders of Rovanion, and there are the Eastern Wainriders. And the distinction appears to be that while this former group, the Wainriders of Rovanion, met with great initial success, they had sort of a difficult time consolidating and really expanding their power from that position. They maintained their presence along the eastern fringes of Mirkwood, possibly into the Fourth Age, potentially. We hear about the Balcoth in the later Third Age. They were never rooted out of here. And we don't really hear of any attempt by Gondor or any other faction to take this territory south of the Kelduin and east of Mirkwood back. So it is somewhat of a controversial suggestion, but one I think that does bear a bit of scrutiny, that there may be, even into the Fourth Age, descendants of those Wainriders of Rovanion still living along the fringes of the forest. But at any rate, this was one group. They met with some initial success, but were defeated in some later battles. However, they were never driven out. The Great Invasion of the year 1944, however, was conducted by a different group, and these are who is referred to as the Eastern Wainriders. This invasion was on the heels of the expansion of this group of Wainriders, who are described as living, beyond the Sea of Rune, and having expanded their territory into the south, making war on the peoples of Khand and even near Harad, entering into an alliance with those groups, gathering them, even gathering Wainriders of Ravanian to the muster south of the Sea of Rune, and then sending that tremendous force west, featuring lots of cavalry, featuring lots of chariots, and overwhelming the standard of the king before they were in turn defeated in the Battle of the Camp. These were consistently referred to as the Eastern Wainriders, and the Wainriders of Ravanian appear in 1944 to have been acting almost as vassals or mercenaries for this larger group. So Great Rune is a very interesting faction. It seems as though we're representing them here in the mod as not initially in conflict with Gondor, right? These are the guys who may have been somehow related, certainly culturally, to the Western Horde, but initially their concerns are over to the east. Now, as you can tell, we've given them territory extending westward to encourage them to have some early-ish contact with Gondor. There is the possibility, as we'll see on the map shortly, that they could capture some rebel territory and then find themselves bordering Ithilien relatively early. However, that's probably not what is likely to happen when this faction is controlled by the AI. I suspect instead they're going to make room for themselves to the south, to the north as well, possibly get into conflicts with these peoples, as historically did happen, and then turning into the west. So the hope is that this is a faction under AI control that will grow and become very powerful and a big problem for Gondor, kind of in the middle of the campaign or the late campaign. So just if you're playing as Gondor, just as you're sort of managing to hold off the tide of the Western Horde, trying to hold off against Umbar along the coasts, maybe trying to establish yourselves against the tribes of Harad, and any other problems from your northwest potentially, then you've got to contend with this large Easterling faction that is emerging. So hopefully it'll kind of work out like that. Now, if you're playing as Great Rune, I believe we plan to set it up so that you will be initially allied with the Western Horde, but it will not be one of those strong alliances necessarily. In other words, we don't have any illusions about trying to prevent these factions from fighting. If they end up fighting, that's fine. Obviously, we don't want them to go to war with each other too early, but the idea that these factions would have gotten along perfectly well doesn't really seem borne out by the evidence. Certainly in Cirion and Eorl, in the prelude to that 1944 campaign, we hear of Great Rune, or we hear of the Eastern Wainriders, rather, expanding and making aggressive war on their neighbors. And so I see no reason why that could not also have been the case with the Western Horde or the Wainriders of Ravanian, if history had worked out a little bit differently. But the goal certainly initially will be for this faction, if you're playing them, to, expand in your area, get a really strong position, and then make that push west and try to pay attention instead of allowing your captains to have a drunken party in Ithilien when you think you have achieved your victory, because that doesn't always work out too well. So as usual, I'd like to read the intro text for the faction here. And again, some of these units here, if you want to take a look at some beautiful work by Weba84, by Valor on various aspects of like the banners and things, you do perhaps owe it to yourself to take a look at those videos for the unit rosters. Again, not because of the videos themselves, but simply because you can catch a glimpse at some really great work by the artists on the team. So Great Rune, we're estimating that these guys may be bull roaring in terms of difficulty. Again, this is probably a holdover from when we used the 4th Age faction of the Chiefdom of Rune, which was rated as bull roaring, but that seems about reasonable to me. These guys will not have a terribly easy time. You will have a border to your east, but you've got several factions around you. You've got the Avari to your northwest, although initially they will not be hostile. They may be a force you do want to reckon with at some point, because there are some nice coastal provinces around the Sea of Rune, and they will be trying to defend or expand into them. You also have the Highland Tribes, which is the 3rd Easterling faction, right? There are 3. of these Easterling factions here in terms of culture, but the Highland tribes is rather different, and they are a little more infantry focused, and they don't have any chariotry. There is no Wayne element to this faction. They're sort of picturing them as the losers as the Wainriders have expanded to take control of the lowlands and the plains, the more populated areas perhaps. The Highland tribes have either moved into the mountains in the north, into that inaccessible terrain where the chariots are not going to operate effectively, or they are the people who have just always lived there, Easterlings who have always chosen to live in that landscape. And then to your south, you'll have Cond, the chiefdom of Cond, which, as we know from both Unfinished Tales and Appendix A, featured in that 1944 campaign, or at least the run-up to that campaign. Certainly the aggression was on the part of the Eastern Wainriders initially, but Cond seems to have held its own fairly well. The fact that the Eastern Wainriders were able to make war on the peoples of Near Harad, which is located right around here, does indicate that they came to some sort of settlement with Cond. Either Cond was treated as a protectorate, which I think unlikely, or they were able to come to some sort of truce, some sort of agreement whereby the Wainriders could move through their territory to attack their other southern neighbors. Again, I think the latter is more likely the case because we don't hear of Cond entering into any kind of subjugation with the Wainriders. We hear of Cond in Kirion and Eorl, and I believe also in Appendix A, as entering into an alliance. And we do also hear that word alliance referred to in the campaign of 1944 when there is mention made of the cavalry and the men that have been sent north from their allies in Cond. So there seems to be maybe a bit of a stalemate, maybe a bit of reckoning going on here. And we're trying to model that by making Cond not a total pushover faction for Great Rune, especially. So there'll be some interesting challenges to the south. So all this is by way of saying this is going to be maybe a tricky campaign in terms of handling your neighbors, but not insurmountable. It's not supposed to be an incredibly difficult one. Okay, so here's the intro text. The East is the first home of men, and here men remain. Even after the migrations of the legendary past, after the arrival of the tall and elf-bright sea kings, after the humiliations of defeat in battle and camp burnings, men remain in the East to push back against the West. And now the East is strong. Led by chariot kings in brilliant bronze, their armies make the earth tremble. But the men of the East are not warriors only. Mighty in battle, they are also canny in alliance. How could it be otherwise? Great Rune is not one tribe or kingdom among many. Like forged iron, it has the strength of many parts, beaten together and tempered in flame. Where once tribes roamed or kings built cities of mud brick, now Great Rune contains them all, like the light of the rising sun swallows the stars. Some refuse the proffered hand. To the north, the tribes of the Highlands and the strange dwarf folk choose impoverished freedom. To the south, the people of Cond and the tribes of Harad may prove allies of convenience, or stubborn rivals. In the van of the great conquest, the western horde has made the first move, taking broad lands and many slaves among the Northmen of Rovanion. They have proven that the men of Gondor can be beaten, but the horde will not be the only ones to claim the spoils of the west. Great Rune is the conquering east, and rising at last, it will drive its ancient foe into the sea. So, yeah, a lot of themes we're trying to get across with this faction. In particular, the theme of the sun, the idea of flame and the sun, the rising of men, that sense of terrible pride that we can see associated with men at their worst in the stories of Tolkien. That all seems very appropriate for this faction. They are not a mob, certainly, but a very... you might think of them as like Nimrod, the builders of the Tower of Babel, right, in the biblical stories. That all seems appropriate there. So, at any rate, let's take a look at the campaign map and see how Great Rune's prospects may look to you. Here on the campaign map, the first thing you're going to notice is the unique settlement design for Great Rune. This is very much a sort of a nomadic-inspired settlement. There is a distinction between the minor settlements, the villages here, that are not settlements where you can train things or build buildings, but they represent secondary settlements, as it says, places where you might expect populations to gather and that are going to, I believe, sort of act as a sort of mining income or land tax income type of thing for you. And the actual settlements themselves, which is the places where you will be able to do your training and building and all of that usual stuff. The design here is, of course, very nomadic, Eastern nomadic inspired, steppe cultures, Mongolian in particular. And this was put together by Valor and Weba84, two of them working together to get these settlements to where they are today. So really interesting layouts here. We've got a variety of settlement sizes here as well, and so some distinctions as well in terms of defenses that you can see. My understanding of, like, say, Mongol settlements is very, very small, but I've learned a little bit over the course of basically listening to these guys work on the settlements. And they did build cities, right? We tend not to assume nomadic steppe peoples built things permanently. But while you do see a lot of sort of like yurts, gurs, I believe is the other term, essentially, tents that can be dismantled and moved over great distances, we also see, sort of an open street layout, or in other words, spaces that have been left for people, animals. There is some planning made in these cities, and these are places that would be returned to, as I understand. People might move in, people might move out, but the settlement site would remain. And in some cases, there are some of these more permanent buildings, as you can see in this largest settlement. This is, in fact, your capital here, and it's farthest to the east, right on the edge of the map. And we imagined that, in terms of lore, the Eastern Wainriders would certainly have gone off map to some extent, but we tried to show that by giving them some of these more secondary settlements and giving them somewhat of a larger presence here in this territory. That said, what do we start off with? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6 settlements, actually. So as you can tell from the mini-map as well as from the preview map on the faction selection screen, Great Rune does start off with quite a western extent of territory. And I was mentioning earlier that there's some rebel territory to your west, southern Ravanian, and it's really only 1 or 2 provinces before you start to get over towards North Ithilien. So if you were so inclined, you could make a quick eastern push to cut off Ithilien from your neighbors of the Western Horde. Might not be a terrible move, I guess, in the sense that they would still be at war with Gondor, and Gondor owns territory here, remember. So they would still be more inclined to fight across the Anduin than to attack you, I would imagine, at least for a while. Of course, on the other hand, getting a border with Gondor is going to be, at best, a very mixed blessing, and it's unlikely that you're going to have the initial forces to make a go of it right early on. You're going to be very far from your own operating zone. You're going to be very far from your power centers here. So it's going to be difficult to get reinforcements and to really keep up the pressure on Gondor. You could certainly conduct a raid potentially, but this is the heartland, right? I mean, Gondor is going to just be able to train a lot of troops from this area, and even if you win a few battles and get down to where their cities are, you can expect some reinforcements coming from the heartland. So my preferred option might be, instead of heading west early on, maybe to head south or even sort of southwest into Nirn. This part of Mordor is going to be accessible. The northwest is not. So this is going to be the barren wasteland. There were no military actions occurring in or around this area during the time frame of the mod, so we're not going to have this accessible. It just wouldn't do in terms of theme for your Great Rune forces to pass through this territory, essentially. It didn't happen in the lore. And there are, some reasons for that. However, Nirn seems to have been fairly fertile, and it would be good for the Easterling factions to be able to take advantage of that. And really, this will be a nice little cul-de-sac in some ways, sort of safe from reprisal. If you can get it and hold it, you might grow some substantial wealth. Of course, you'll be fighting for that with Khand, who is going to be a little bit to your south. And if you can get here first, that'll be quite the advantage, but you'll also potentially be leaving a couple of your southern cities open to Khand as they potentially seek to move north. I imagine for Great Rune, a lot of your strategy is, of course, going to depend on what the other factions are doing, and I just don't know yet how that's going to all play out. And in fact, there may be several alternate routes. So Khand is, as we've seen down here, and they may seek to expand north and west early on, or they may go west and south and get into fights with Harad. No idea how that's going to play out, and it may go, in a couple of different directions from campaign to campaign. So that'll be interesting to try to track, and probably necessary for you to get some spies down there, at least some agents, to see how Khand is doing, and then kind of make your moves accordingly. One of the other factors of the East is, like a lot of the other places of Middle-earth, we've got some more tree cover here than you may remember from 4th Age Total War. The trees only really die out in the south and in the territory of Khand, and so you've got a little more forests to contend with. A good early move then, I imagine, will be building roads and making sure that you can keep your armies on those roads and out of the trees. The lowlands are wealthy. They're going to be certainly more wealthy than like, say, the Highland tribes starting territory. But they do have the potential disadvantage of this tree cover, meaning that if you end up fighting in the woods with your chariots, that is going to be quite a disadvantage. But yeah, looking at this screen here, we can see the distinction in settlement levels here. So let's start over here at one of the very smallest ones. Well, actually, we can go all the way to the west and look at this sort of small. This is actually a middlemanish style village, a recent acquisition, no doubt, by Great Rune. And over here, we've got probably the comparable level of settlement here. We've got some, looks like animal pens. We've got some, some more of those tents set up around the place with a large central chieftain's tent, no doubt in the middle there. We've got a few things that we're going to move, of course. We've got resources here, the wild game and the honey, which is going to be moved off somewhere else away from the settlement. But otherwise, what you're seeing here is largely what you're going to get. This, of course, is a very small unwalled settlement. We see this grow a little bit over here with Thamas here. This now has a wall. You can see there are more of those tents clustered around, and especially outside the wall. And then that, of course, continues here, where we've got a much more substantial wall structure. We've got some permanent buildings in the center, and then some tents clustering around close to the fringes of the wall, both in and outside. And another thing I want to point out here is the new UI for the Wainriders on the campaign map. We've got a more, I think this is more of a nod toward their steppe origins, right? We've got this cloth element here in the background of these various elements of the screen. We've still got some wood, and the rope here may be a new element. I can't remember, but I know Valor and Webb have been working on this relatively recently, so this is going to be the first time you've seen this. This will be for, I believe, all the Easterling factions. So it's got to cover just the differences of culture there, but I think it does a good job of doing that. Now, one point of contrast between Great Rune and, say, the Chiefdom of Rune that appeared in 4th Age Total War is that you do not begin with any territory adjacent to the Sea of Rune itself. You will need to fight for that. There are some rebel settlements around the fringes here. There are also some settlements held by the Avari elves. Those are not going to be a very numerous people initially, but they are likely to be a faction you'll have some dealings with, most likely hostile, I would imagine. This island here does have a settlement initially, so you may want to conquer all of this at some point, and it may make sense to do this before heading west in earnest. If it were me, I might like to consolidate my position in the south, capture all of Rhun, maybe get a nice settlement here to sort of block off the aggression of Khand, and then maybe turn my attention north for a while, go around the Sea of Rune, get some territory, perhaps even along the Kelduin, assuming the Western Horde has not come back in this way and attempted to take that for themselves. And then maybe go up and deal with the Highlanders up around here. Not that you're going to be able to make great use of the mountains, but it might be good just to check them, just to contain them a little bit, and maybe have a nice border along the rivers and the mountains and the dense forests. As you can see, though, as you go further into the north, that forest terrain is going to become a lot more thick. It's going to be a lot more rough, not so suitable for cavalry and chariot warfare. So it's going to be something to get used to. But ultimately, of course, you're going to want to drive into the west. And how this is going to go, man, it really depends on how that war is shaping up between Gondor and the Western Horde. This is going to be a war starting from the beginning of the campaign, So it's likely the AI is going to pursue it to the bitter end. That could be with the Western Horde earning some territory, and maybe Gondor folding, right? It could be that Gondor starts to lose territory west of the Anduin, maybe other neighboring factions start piling on, and then they're in full retreat. If you see that happening, you might want to get in on the action sooner rather than later, because you don't want to let the Western Horde take all of this rich, very powerful territory for themselves. So you may want to start a fight soon if that happens. On the other hand, it might be more likely that Gondor holds its own and even starts to push back, and the Western Horde could really get into trouble. Remember, there are some other factions in the Anduin Vale here, the Aotheod, who are likely to also be at war with the Horde, and may start moving through the trees here and giving your Easterling brothers a bit of a trouble. So you may see them on the defense. And if that's the case, who do you want to have as your neighbor? So you may be fighting on their behalf just to sort of hold off the tide of some of these Western factions, or even a faction in the north, like the League of the North, centered around the Long Lake. They could potentially be a very strong faction and kind of a check on your expansion if they are allowed to grow. So we're trying to give the idea of the big, sprawling barbarian chiefdom here, but I use the term barbarian very loosely. We also want to give a sense of extravagance, power, strength, a certain kind of culture. As you can tell, I've got a bit of a soft spot for the Easterlings, and so it'll be nice to explore them, in a way that's maybe a little more humanized than we see sometimes. Here in the Third Age might be their high point, though there certainly will be some Sauronic influence here. As I've said in my Wainriders lore video, I think it's more interesting and maybe more lore accurate to think of the Easterlings during the Wainrider period as coalescing almost on their own, and really putting up a great and worthy challenge to Gondor in that period. They were not led by Sauron. They were not following him super overtly necessarily. He was not welding them together. He just gave them a little push in the direction of the west, a push that they probably didn't need in the first place. But at any rate, I hope you've enjoyed this look at Great Rune, our final faction for the campaign previews. We'll try to keep up the weekly updates for Wainriders with Wainrider Wednesdays, but they will most likely be on smaller things, looking at particular mechanics, aspects of the map, aspects of the units, and so on. So if you have any ideas of things you'd like to see, aspects of the mod you're curious about, maybe leave me a comment, and I can see if I can answer those questions, maybe in the form of a video or two. Well, again, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the channel for other videos on the Wainriders, and I'll see you in the next one.